Welcome once again to the William King Museum of Art podcast. This is the podcast where we talk with people who are associated with our museum, who bring shows to our museum, or who are artists in our museum. Today, I have with me Dr. Elliot King. Could you introduce yourself, Dr. King?
Absolutely. Thanks, Russell. I'm Elliot King, and I am a professor of art history at Washington and Lee University and a specialist in the work of Salvador Dali.
Yes. Now, some people may have only a passing awareness of Salvador Dali. Like they know the name, they know maybe the lobsters, they know the mustache, but maybe they don't know exactly who he is beyond the melting clock. So what would you say people might recognize him for? What was his relationship to surrealism? How would you sum up Dali as a character, maybe?
Great question. So when I encounter people, it's a nice thing to be able to say that I work on Salvador Dali, because many people at least know who he is.
Yeah.
Not everybody, though. So some people are like, okay, so that name rings a bell. But I said, well, he has a big mustache. As you said, he has a handlebar mustache that was very famous, particularly when he was on television in the 50s and 60s. Many people will know his painting, The Persistence of Memory, which is the about 8.5 by 11 canvas at the Museum of Modern Art.
Now, I want to specify real quick, 8.5 by 11 inches.
Yes,
people are going to think it's a lot bigger than it actually is.
Right. No, don't be deceived. You'll have to get really close to it. And he painted it with a really tiny brush. Exactly. But that's the droopy watches with ants and flies. So I think a lot of people will probably know his work even because the style of it has really become what people think of when they say, like, oh, it's surrealist work. It looks dreamy. It looks strange. It works unusual. It looks like you've just walked into a dream or a nightmare.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way to sum it all up. But speaking of surrealism, so when people say surreal, they generally just use that to mean weird or strange or, unnerving. Unheimlichkeit, I think, is the term. But that's not how the surrealists thought about surrealism. What's the difference between the popular conception of what is surreal and what the surrealists were actually trying to do?
Right. So it's a really interesting point with Dali's work, because his work has certainly become the popular idea of surrealism. The surrealists themselves, surrealism began as a literary movement in France in the early 1920s. It grew out of the Paris Dada movement. And part of their idea at the beginning was to really get into their subconscious and try to find new well springs for creativity, for new well springs for poetic expression, because they were writers, they weren't painters. So they wanted to write poems that were coming from some hidden place that they were trying to access. And the surrealists found all kinds of ways of accessing that. They tried hypnotism, they tried doing automatic writing, where you just write anything that comes into your head. But for a long time, they weren't really sure if you could even be a surrealist artist. It was all about surrealist writing. And when they defined it in 1924 in the Surrealist Manifesto, authored by the surrealist leader, André Breton, he called it a pure psychic automatism, so automatic way of thought, outside of any moral or aesthetic preoccupation. So it's just supposed to be whatever came into your head without really thinking, is it attractive? Is it the right thing to come out of your head? Just whatever comes out, that's surrealism. It'll be surprising, it'll be shocking, it'll be upsetting, but it's freedom. And that freedom word is probably the watchword that I think really resonates throughout all of surrealism.
Yeah, because you're essentially liberating yourself from the superego, as Freud would consider it, and going even past the ego towards the id almost.
Yeah, certainly avoiding that superego that might be the buffer on everything, but also that has social ramifications. So taking it from the superego, but also being against institutions in society. You want to be against government institutions. You want to be against religious institutions. Anything that they felt was telling them to be or act a certain way, they were against that, because it was against their notion of freedom.
Right. So speaking about the relationship between artists and writers, I'm sort of surprised to hear that the writers weren't even sure whether you could be a visual artist and a surrealist. So what was the relationship? How were the artists and writers communicating? They were communicating in magazines, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really productive ways of thinking about it is that surrealism is never an art style or a literary style. That it's usually thought of today maybe more like impressionism. And so when we said like, it's surrealist, then it looks dreamy. But the surrealist wouldn't have thought of it that way. It was really a process for doing something. It was a means to an end, and that end was liberation of ideas. And so you would really have writers who were doing surrealism. Maybe we should say surrealists who do writing, or you would say surrealists who do art, surrealists who do all sculpture. But really the fundamental thing was that they were doing surrealism in all of these different ways. Initially, as I said, it was really in terms of writers. The first artist to come along was André Masson. And Masson joined the Surrealist group in around 1924. And he was doing automatic drawings where he would just draw and scribble sort of whatever came into his head as a visual equivalent of automatic writing. And the Surrealists thought that was really interesting, but it wasn't really visually compelling. They were a little bit disappointed.
It looked like nonsense because it sort of was.
Yeah, well, it was kind of like doodles, right?
Yeah.
And so, but it ignited a pretty fierce debate within the group of, can we have surrealist painting? And if we did, what would it look like? So in 1927, Pierre Naville, one of the writers, is boldly saying, there's clearly no such thing as surrealist painting, because to write automatically, you can be very fast. But to paint automatically is very hard, they felt, because you would have to plan which color you're going to use. There's a lot of conscious thought that goes into it. And even if you decided to paint your dreams, as some artists were beginning to try to do, if you can imagine trying to tell somebody about your dream, you can probably tell the general gist of the dream. But if somebody asks you, okay, well, what color shirt were you wearing? Do you remember that exactly? Do you remember exactly what everything is around you? Were you wearing a hat? Do you remember every little detail? Eventually, if you try to actually paint that scene, you're going to have to make some conscious decisions. And that's where the surrealists really kind of ran up against the wall. And they said, at that point, it's not unconscious anymore. Now you're just painting a picture. And so is that really automatic? Is that really subconscious? Is that really free? Or are you just now making aesthetic choices, which is exactly what they didn't want to do? So there were some real struggles there, but the surrealists felt like, okay, well, art has a place in it if it's done the right way. And so they were interested in opening up a gallery. They wanted to have surrealist exhibitions, but they were really wrestling with how would that look and what part would that really play within surrealism.
So that's interesting that you brought up Naville, because there's a later manifesto. There were a lot of surrealist manifestos that Breton wrote, where he sort of lists Naville as one of the idealists amongst them. So there were some that were too materialistically speaking, too mechanistic, I think he said, and then there were some who were too idealist in terms of their conception of what surrealism was.
Breton is so across the board all the time. I mean,
well, he changes his mind.
He does, and I mean, I don't even take that as a criticism against him, because you imagine, he's really trying.
Yeah.
He's trying to keep the movement together, and people have permission to change their ideas as they go, and the world changes tremendously around him. So it's hard to really put a pin in Breton and say like, okay, well, this is what surrealism is about, because it does change over time, and even that definition. Where he talks about moral and aesthetic considerations, there comes a point where like, maybe I was too hasty with saying we're against morality, because what are the implications of that later on? What are the political ramifications of surrealism later on? So it's a little bit of a moving target.
Yeah, and in fact, André Breton was actually one of the champions pretty early on of Salvador Dali's paranoiac critical method. So maybe we could get into that a bit. What separated Salvador Dali from the other surrealist artists, in particular the paranoiac critical method, which he does define in his writings, but he's a very poetic writer, let's say.
Poetic's a nice way of putting it. He's a very Baroque writer. Yeah, he makes anything that could be easy to understand, he tries to complicate.
Yes.
So so the paranoiac critical method it's really born out of an idea that automatism, the main vehicle of surrealist visuals at that time was passive. Basically, you would just sit down like Andre Masson and let drawings just come through you as if you're a medium, just kind of letting the unconscious speak through your pen, and whatever comes out is what comes out. And Dali specifically wanted what he called an active means of generating imagery, not passive, but active. And so the way that he perceived it was what he called the critical paranoiac method, which, at the basic way of framing it is not really as thorny as he made it. A very simple way of thinking about it is looking at clouds. And he actually uses this metaphor later on, so I don't mind calling it this, but you look at clouds, and I might look at a cloud and I might say, oh, look, it looks like a chicken. And somebody else might look at the exact same cloud and think it looks like something else, right? They're like, oh no, it looks like Louis XIV. And we're all looking at the same cloud, but we're reading it differently. It's a bit like a Rorschach test in that way. And for Dali, it's like, okay, so we have reality out there, but the way we're interpreting reality is very subjective. It's very much based on, why am I seeing a chicken? Why is that person seeing Louis XIV? Why is this person seeing something else? And so we're always bringing our subconscious ideas to bear on this thing called reality. And for him, this is why he calls it paranoiac. Now, I should specify that he's not using the word paranoia like we do today. Now we're using paranoia to mean you're afraid of things, or you feel like people are out to get you. But the original Greek of paranoia means other mind. And it really was just a sort of a catch-all for lots of different mental states that involved seeing the world differently. It could be hallucinations, it could be all sorts of things. But it was just sort of a skewed way of looking at the world. And so when he talks about paranoia, he's deliberately misreading reality. He's, I'm seeing something else out there. But then the critical part steps in, where he says, okay, so what is it about me that made me think of that? What is it about you that made you think of that? So I'm not just going to go with it. I'm going to wonder and really self-explore to figure that out. And that's how a lot of his pictures are made. His double images are often made that way, where I'm going to look at a pile of fruit and I'm going to see a face. But I'm going to construct it in such a way that you see the face too. So you see exactly what I'm seeing. And we can't just accept that it's just fruit anymore. Maybe it's something else. The reality has been challenged, and that's something really important to him. And that was a huge new idea for surrealism.
Yeah, and he puts that as paranoia almost becoming a sort of productive force, because that like you say, that ability to look at the painting and see all of these various things suddenly gets transferred out into the real world, and you begin questioning what you see or making different associations.
Absolutely. Saying it's a productive way is a wonderful way of thinking about it.
So we as art historians, we're willing to accept to a certain point, I think, and you can say no, absolutely not, but accept up to a certain point what the artist says. But then we're also always going to be looking at, well, who were they looking at, right? What kinds of art were they exposed to? So Dali was an admirer of several different artists, but the ones he lists the most tend to be Vermeer, Velázquez, and Picasso. So is there a certain kind of thread or an impact that you think these guys all had on his work? Or do you think that it can be summed up so easily?
Well, Picasso is a little bit of the wild card within that triad. He was a huge admirer of Vermeer, certainly, and Velázquez for very different reasons. He in great artists of the past, whoever they were, he admired different things. And so in Vermeer, he was fascinated by the small scale of his works, the light and the sense of mystery that Vermeer puts forward. In Velázquez, being a great Spanish artist, he was excited about the Baroque way that Velázquez would convey so much with just what he called like kind of a staccato of his brush, that he could throw some paint against the brooch of the Infanta Margarita, and you could see all of the lights dazzling just in one brushstroke. So that's amazing. He also admired Ernest Meissonier, a 19th century French academic painter, because he also painted very small scale, but very, very tight, almost like not like Vermeer, but at least in that same sort of highly naturalistic way. Raphael, he loves Raphael. He talks a ton about Raphael and the beauty, almost divine qualities of a Raphael painting. So he looks back at artists that he admires because I think he really wants to be part of that. I mean,
Yeah.
he wants to be sort of the Raphael of the 20th century. I mean, he puts that out there pretty boldly. Picasso is a more complicated relationship because he knew Picasso. He knew Picasso in the 1920s. He went to Paris and he went and saw Picasso. Picasso helped finance his first trip to the United States. So there was actually a friendship there. But he also was really in competition with Picasso because Picasso by that time was a huge 20th century master artist, and Dali was sort of this burgeoning young Spaniard, and he wanted to be better than Picasso and more well known than Picasso. And so for a lot of Dali's life, he tends to put himself against Picasso. There were the two geniuses of Spain. But he always throws himself in there with Picasso. But of course, again, they were very different politically, they were very different stylistically, and Dali always wanted to sort of actually draw that distinction that, Picasso is a genius, so am I. Picasso is a communist, neither am I. So,
Yes.
like, how do we make those distinctions clear? So I think he almost used Picasso as a foil for most of the 20th century rather than really as somebody to look to. In fact, some of his later writings say that Picasso ruined modern art because it was so bad that it couldn't get any worse, and that sort of paved the way for somebody like Dali to come in and rebuild modern art. So he does a lot of backhanded compliments against Picasso.
Very interesting. So when we look at Dali's work, he uses and reuses a lot of symbols, and then he'll change, and he sort of gets very interested in certain things for periods of his career, and then he'll get interested in other things. Mm-hmm. In the series of prints that we're going to be having, in particular, I'm trying to think here. For example, in this particular, we get images of the Angelus. For example, images of certain types of food. There's sort of almost a proto form, which is like this sausage-like creature that seems to go about, which I'm not entirely certain of. But what do you think what do you think the significance or what some of these objects meant to Dali, and which ones should we pay maybe the most attention to?
Well, I think that probably the key is to look really closely at the images and look for continuities, because you're absolutely right that you will see certain things over and over again. And I think that that's what makes them sort of interesting. You'll see I mentioned Messenier, you'll see a background image of Napoleon in the clouds in one of those images. And so if you're kind of attuned to some of the things, or if you're attuned to some of his paintings already, you'll see quotations from some of his paintings sort of tucked away in all of these images. There are those beans, or they look like sausages or beans, and a lot of people have asked me what those mean, and I don't really know. I'll be honest. I know at one point he talks about beans being the sort of mealy vegetable that has to accompany meat. And that's one way that he interpreted it, but it's certainly not the only way. The Angelus figures, that's a painting that I'm happy to talk more about, but that's a painting from the mid-19th century that really fascinated Dali, particularly at this time. He was writing an entire book about his fascination with the Angelus. And so you see the man and the woman from the Angelus painting over and over again, showing up in some of those images. Skulls, stretched skulls that are sort of anamorphic skulls, like coming out of Hans Holbein. You'll see lots of different images. And I think just sort of taking it and thinking like, okay, well, how do these things connect? Not necessarily how do I read them iconographically, but what kind of a feeling do they give? Because really they're about the feeling of the book, not illustrations of the book at all. It's very much how did Dali feel reading Songs of Maldoror, and what kind of images did this book, as crazy as it is, provoke in his head?
Well, we've mentioned the book, so I'll just explain what we've got here. This is going to be an exhibition of prints that Salvador Dali was commissioned to make as illustrations for a book called Chants de Maldoror. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I took Italian, not French. But it's, like you said, the Songs of Maldoror. And they were published by Albert Schira in the 1930s. And the book, Le Chants de Maldoror, was actually initially written around the 1890s. So in terms of the project of the illustrations, what can you tell us about? Because what can you tell us about that? Because you're sort of an expert on that in particular, if I'm thinking right.
So, if I could say just a little bit about the book first, I think.
Oh, yes,
Shall I?
please.
Okay, because I think that'll help.
Yes.
Which is that the book is extremely strange.
I read through it. I have to say, I read through it, and I do agree with you. For any viewers who do want to read that book, be prepared.
It's I believe it opens up saying that the deadly emanations of these pages will absorb your soul like sugar absorbs water.
Yes.
So it's kind of a, you know, abandon hope all ye who enter here sort of book. It's I mean, it's a fascinating book, but very, very strange. It was written by Isidore Ducasse, who went by the pen name the Count of Lautréamont. And when he wrote it, he really only published two things. He wrote a book of poems and he wrote the Songs of Maldoror. And the first time he published it was around 1869. And it was just one of the songs. It wasn't the whole thing. And nobody paid any attention. It was just sort of looked at and thought, like, this is awful. It doesn't make any sense. It's the wandering of this horrible character who is sort of tormented. He's against God. He's against humanity. It's not even clear if he's even human. It's very vulgar and sadistic and anti-religious. And basically, nobody wanted to even touch the Songs of Maldoror. Ducasse died a year later in 1870, and the book wasn't published until after his death. And even then, again, it was looked at as being, oh, this is a weird book. It makes no sense. Who would want to read this? And it was basically fallen into obscurity. Well, in the 19 teens, you started to get these sort of avant-garde artists, avant-garde writers who were finding the copy down in the, you know, Paris Bibliothèque Nationale and transcribing it and saying, you know, this is a really interesting poetic book. There, you know, it is strange, it is completely unexpected, but isn't that what modernism is? And so there was a revival around Lautréamont. Philippe Soupeau, one of the first poets of the Surrealist movement, he did his own transcription and an edition of Maldoror in 1927. So as the Surrealists sort of begin mobilizing, they're looking at Maldoror, and they find in this very strange dream logic and these sorts of strange juxtapositions in the very Baroque, fantastic way that Lautréamont writes, a real poetic way of thinking, like, okay, so this is freedom because this is so strange, it's so unusual, this is what literature could be. And they really model a lot of their writing off of Maldoror. So it became really almost a classic, an instant classic in Surrealism. So in about 1933, Albert Schira, who was then, you know, a Swiss publisher, was he was publishing the Surrealist magazine called Minotaur. And he was publishing books, and one that he wanted to do was he wanted to do a deluxe edition of the Songs of Maldoror. And how Dali came onto this project isn't entirely clear. Dali had done some book illustration before. Some say Picasso recommended him. We don't really know exactly kind of what tipped Schira to ask Dali, but certainly his style was befitting the sort of imagery within this, because it was very dark, it was very grotesque in a lot of ways. And so Schira asked Dali to do this series of works. And I think he planned to actually print about 200 copies, which he never got, he ran out of finances and wasn't able to print that many. But one of the really strange things about the whole series is that he gave Dali the sort of carte blanche of saying, okay, illustrate the book. And I can only imagine that he imagined that the illustrations would come back looking like things in the book, because that's what illustration means. But Dali didn't do that. Instead, he used his paranoiac critical method, and he read the book and decided to draw the things that the book made him think about. So if you're going through the exhibition and you're looking at these images, I mean, you don't have to be kind of scratching your head and thinking, gosh, I've never read Maldoror. I wonder what I'm missing. Don't worry, because actually there's only one image in the entire thing, which happens to have a sewing machine in it, that has anything directly to do with Lautréamont and Songs of Maldoror. Everything else is really the ideas that Dali was having at that time in his life, which is, again, one of the reasons it makes it interesting for art historians, because it's not just about the book, but it's really, where was Dali at this particular moment when he took on this really major commission?
So you brought up the sewing machines.
Yes.
I think that's a prime opportunity to talk about the sewing machine and the umbrella, because that, I mean, it's sort of that quotation. I believe the beauty of a chance encounter between a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table or a dissecting table, is it?
Yep.
Is the famous phrase from the Songs of Maldoror, and one that the surrealists in particular really glommed onto, if I could say it so.
Yes, absolutely. So you think about how surrealists were interested in putting unlike things together and what kind of a spark that would create in collages or in surrealist objects. So just those words of taking a sewing machine and an umbrella, how odd to put those things together, and where are you going to put them? On a dissecting table? Like, the whole thing is just so weird, but it also creates a very poetic image. I mean, it's, what does that sewing machine mean? What does the umbrella mean? And we can talk about different ideas around it, but the surrealists were really latched onto it. What a fantastical sort of turn of phrase, right? To bring that up and make us think about just that image. It's very conjuring.
And to pose it as like an ideal beauty too.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it almost feels like the dream images maybe of a de Chirico, who's whom they really admired, or things that just seem so out of place in these unusual landscapes. There's something very evocative about that sewing machine and umbrella image. And now, what in the book, it's actually referring to the beauty of a particular young man named Mervyn.
Yes.
And so Maldoror sees this young man and he says, oh, he's as beautiful as, and he lists all of these things he's as beautiful as, the retracting claws of a bird of prey. And one of those is he's as beautiful as the chance encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Which is interesting, because then, it's sort of, okay, well, how might we read this maybe through a Freudian lens? It's clearly homoerotic, because Maldoror is looking to Mervyn. So we have the sewing machine and the umbrella. Is the sewing machine a symbol of female domesticity traditionally? Is the umbrella like a phallic shape, or is it more of a parasol? Is how can we kind of interpret these images? Lots of ways you can kind of extract from them, but I think that's what the surrealists really liked about it, is that they kind of gave you a little bit of space to look at. They're like, how do I look at those things, and what kind of associations can I come up with on this phrase that was written, over 100 years ago?
It was the tension between the objects that really counted.
Yeah.
So another very important image, we brought it up, the Angelus. So Dali had a whole set of theories behind the Angelus. He sort of viewed it as, and I think, yes, an atavistic and cybernetic sort of image. He said in one of his books, which those two things don't really go together in my mind, very loosely, but so it was incredibly popular. It was reproduced so many times. Could you show us your inkwell, please?
I will. So the Angelus. So this is my little inkwell, which I was so excited to find. This is a little bronze inkwell.
Talk about exploitation of labor, huh?
Right. Well, I mean, the story with the inkwell. So this is from the 19th century, and during the 19th century, it was an extremely popular image. It was really sort of the Mona Lisa of its day. Before the Mona Lisa became as popular as it is, the Angelus was everywhere. You could buy, if you get onto eBay now, you can find old Angelus tea sets and Angelus pillows and all kinds of things. And Dali was really fascinated by that kind of mass culture of this image, because if you just look at it, it was done by Jean-Francois Millet around 1857, and it was originally a commission of two farmers during the potato harvest. And the original person who requested it didn't end up paying, so he changed it around, kind of took out the potatoes and put a little steeple back here, so it would be two people praying at the hour of the Angelus at 6 o'clock. So you have the woman here who has her head bent down. You have the man here And they're both basically praying in that original painting that's at the Musée d'Orsay now. But that image was everywhere. And I was like, okay, so why is this painting so popular? And he also was, thinking of it paranoiacally. Why does it make me uncomfortable? And so after a lot of soul searching, he decided that actually it's a highly sexual image. And this is where, if you could see the actual image itself, he reads this woman as a praying mantis, and says that that basically her intent is to devour her mate here, as mantises were known to do in captivity, of eating the head of the male. And so she has her head bowed down, so she's going to be the praying mantis. She's going to eat the man. He has a little phallic pitchfork here off to the side. And so for him, this was a very sexual storyline. And so he does a lot of paintings of this image in the 1930s, and it shows up everywhere in the Songs of Maldoror because it was seen as a very sort of aggressive, sexually aggressive image, much like when he's reading the book. Now, he always theorized that beneath them there's a basket here, that beneath this basket was the burial place of their dead child, which is extremely macabre. And where he got this idea is who knows, right? But he had the idea that there was a child buried under here. And in the 1950s, I want to say 1950s, 1960s, he was the 1950s, he got permission from the Louvre to actually X-ray the painting. And so he X-rayed it, and the remarkable thing is that they found that there's sort of a weird trapezoidal box in the underpainting beneath that basket. And of course, he took full credit and said, "Well, see, that's the coffin. This is I was right all along." Da 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 da. And he published a book in 1963 called "The Tragic Myth of Mies Angelus." So in the show we have so many of the images from Maldoror that have that, but it's really worth remembering that that's an image that really stays with him through the 1960s, through the 1970s. This is why when you say it's cybernetic, like, I'm not surprised, because he's bringing these two ideas together. It's Freudian, but also sort of looking forward in a strange way, because it's an idea or an image that just haunts Dali throughout really all of his life, and in a very particular way that sort of ruins it if you really wanted to have a nice normal view of Mies Angelus. After you see Dali's transcription of it, you never see the painting the same way again.
Yes, and I suppose it's cybernetic in terms of that it becomes sort of this feedback loop where he can return to it over and over again, and get different, again, feedbacks. So you have the inkwell, but you also have a whole other collection of objects that I'm looking forward very much to coming and seeing. I was wondering, what got you started collecting ephemera, and things like letters, magazines, inkwells, membership cards, even, and why you feel it's important, or why it is important, because we both know it's important to collect that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have paintings, of course, because I can't afford them.
Yes.
But I started when I was, I suppose, in graduate school, just collecting books and things like that. And I think that was born out of the idea of having an active research library, because I would know people who were going to go to the library or who were traveling to a certain place because that was the only place you could get this book. And I would find it online. I was like, well, I'm just going to buy it so I can always have it and I can just sort of keep it. And so I started buying the major books about Dali's life. And it's sort of a snowball effect where you start buying the books and then you'd see something, oh, well, gosh, that's from 1950. That's really neat. Because these things get harder to find, particularly in the earlier days of the internet. And so I started buying sort of these objects of curiosity, because I thought, well, somebody should take care of them, right? I mean, these are just having an archive. It's a fun collection that makes me happy, and it's something that I feel like I can still use. Is that if I'm wondering, oh, well, what pieces were in this particular exhibition, if I have that catalog, I can pull it out instead of searching around or trying to find it online. So I have quite a collection now of I particularly like exhibition catalogs, And the rarer pieces are those that are invitations to exhibitions, because you can imagine that if you get an invitation to something, even if you go, you probably throw the invitation away. And so those are the things that become very rare over time. So if you have an invitation to a Dali exhibition from 1936, that's kind of remarkable. And those are the things that I've begun to collect more, or these things that are really unusual, that I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to take care of them. I have no idea what I'll do with them, but what I really love now is that for the most part, they've just been in my house, in different cabinets and different places, and I just like to see them. But the idea of sharing them with people is really great. I mean, to have them exhibited, I showed them the first time at Washington and Lee, and then at Piedmont Arts, and included them, and they really helped to flesh out the story, because I have some of the catalogs from 1934 where the Maldoror print showed. I have the Time magazine from 1936 when he was on the cover of Time magazine. Some of the different things, I don't exactly know what will be at this exhibition, but there are a lot of different possibilities of just sort of some of those tangible reminders of, okay, so this is where Dali really was. These are the sorts of press things that we're building out. And also, I have to say that the Maldoror show gave me a little bit of a boost to start collecting Maldoror things. And so I bought more early Maldoror books from the Surrealists. I tried to find things that were really Maldoror specific. And that goes even into the 1990s, early 2000s with the Chicago Surrealist group, who are talking about big oil, but have quotations from Lautréamont in there. And so, I mean, it's kind of amazing how the Songs of Maldoror, this isn't a unique thing to Dali. This is something that really expands across surrealism as a real, and it means so many different things to different kinds of people for different causes. And so, you can really take that narrative in a lot of different ways and see how it's important to Dali at this particular moment, but it also becomes kind of a mantra for surrealism overall of, how are we going to defy and how are we going to challenge?
Well, even a little bit beyond, let's say, because, the only book I think that's comparable to Maldoror would actually be one of my personal favorites, Dr. Faustroll by Alfred Jarry,
Yeah.
which has a similar structure and a similar character, but a different sort of conception and different type of narration, let's say.
Mm-hmm. And that absurdity that they really liked within Jarry as well. I mean, yeah, you're certainly on the same path with the surrealism. These are the kinds of books that have it's ridiculous and strange, but also it has a bigger implication if you want to take it on that road.
Yeah. So let's say that somebody's walking into our exhibition for the first time, seeing Dali works in person, or maybe this is the first time they've ever seen a Dali work. So when you're dealing, let's say, with your students who aren't necessarily familiar with art, or people who just aren't familiar with Dali or surrealism, how do you advise them to go about on their first look through? How would you consider them? How would you consider making like a guide for their thought process through the gallery?
Well, I think that what I would advise in all cases is to spend time. I think that, I'm not necessarily always practicing what I preach here, because I'm the best person at going into a museum and just sort of walking through and looking at a gallery saying, okay, I got it, and then walking through. But I think Dali's works particularly encourage a really close looking, because they're very detailed. So I think that really going in, looking at those lines, looking at those tiny details, looking at the tiny figures in the background, this you can go by quickly, but you're going to miss a lot. And so really spending time. I mean, even I've seen people take magnifying glasses in to look at Dali works, and that's not uncalled for in some of these situations. If you can get close enough, it's worth seeing those tiny little details. But with any kind of exhibition, I think that maybe the gallery is as a curator, you'll know that the gallery is probably laid out in a certain intentional way that most people might do, but some people might go a different way. So that some people may decide to go the opposite way. I mean, people do all kinds of things. But I think the important thing is even thinking about, okay, well, how is this installed? Let's think about, maybe there's the pieces, but also, how's the light? Like, do you like the what's the mood of the whole show? And I think that those are the things that people may not necessarily think about if they're not in the museum business, but actually every little detail they have to know has been a deliberate thing. And you know this better than anybody, right? That what texts are there, what is the lighting like, how are the pieces spaced, what has been included, what's the story being told. Just kind of figure like, okay, so a lot of people have made some really deliberate decisions with this. So how can I get the best story I can from this experience? It's not just about looking and taking it in like, okay, this is a story somebody's telling me.
I agree entirely. I know from firsthand because I nail the holes in the wall where the works are going to hang. But we're also very fortunate to have some pieces that were written by your students on the series of works, which is excellent for me because that way I know I can trust what's being written and I don't have to worry about my own quality of research.
Well, that was a really exciting thing. So I was teaching a surrealism seminar at Washington and Lee, and many of the students who took that happened to take it that year were art history majors. But our big project, because this show was coming through, was they chose different pieces to write about, and they researched them. They wrote about them in a researched way that's also accessible to the museum audience. And those texts have been part of the show. They were here in Piedmont, and I'm thrilled they're coming to your institution too, because it's I think it really you need a little bit of a guidance with Songs of Maldoror, but also you don't want to have to explain everything because it could be over-explained in a certain way, and it's nice to have that enigma still there. So hopefully we've caught a little bit of the right tone to give you some guidance, but also leave you some room for your own interpretation.
Yeah, I think they have. I've read through them, and they're very good texts.
I'm so glad.
Let's start with the autobiographical element of his work, because it's interesting because he puts a lot of himself in his own work. So what was his let's get Freudian. Let's talk about his mother and his father too, because his father seems to have had just as much of an impact on him and his artistic output as anything else.
Yes. So I mean, Dali read a lot of Freud by the time he was in his 20s.
Freud called him a fanatic.
He did. And actually, the only surrealists who ever met Breton were Dali and the only surrealists who ever met Freud, the only surrealists who ever met Freud were Breton and Dali. And Freud didn't like surrealism at all. he thought that it didn't make any sense, that it misunderstood his theories, but he thought that Dali was a bit of a fanatic, and that his paintings might be interesting to analyze, but he was a bit of a fanatic himself. Now, I say all of this because by the time he's in his 20s, he's read a lot of Freud, and he's very aware of Freudian interpretations that he can apply to his own pieces. So a lot of it's very deliberate. And this is actually what Freud doesn't like. He said, if you paint an Oedipus complex, you don't have one. if you go out there to say, I have trouble with my mother, that's not subliminal. I mean,
that's that critical element that the surrealists were trying to avoid.
Yeah, you're way too deliberate. You haven't sublimated anything. And so Freud was just like, this isn't what psychoanalysis is about. And also psychoanalysis is about therapy, right? I mean, Freud was trying to help people, and the surrealists just want to exploit these things for creative use. So in terms of his autobiography, what we do know for sure is that he is an unreliable narrator. He's now, a lot of things are true, but a lot of things are false. And sometimes they're false. For example, the first chapter of his autobiography, and I'm speaking here of his 1942 autobiography called The Secret Life of Salvador Dali.
Several autobiographies.
He wrote a lot of text, yes, but an astonishing amount, actually. He wrote, the Dali Foundation did a full collection of his writings, and there's about 5,000 pages of writings. I mean, it's amazing to think about how much this painter that we like to think was a painter really did write.
Yes.
And so he has this autobiography, and it starts out, the first chapter is his memories inside the womb, his intrauterine memories.
Very good.
Yes, and he said it was red and sticky.
That's a good guess, I guess.
Yeah. But then as it goes forward, he talks about his childhood, he talks about different things that happen, and it's really hard to know, okay, well, maybe this is where this painting is coming from, maybe this is what the idea is, or maybe he's just making it up because, he's trying to be controversial, which he always was great at courting controversy. So yeah, the Secret Life makes it especially difficult because as an art historian, you sort of want to read it and be like, oh, well, he's explaining it to us. He's explaining his iconography, but he's also giving you the story he wants you to know. And that story can change over time quite a lot. So you have to always take it with a grain of salt. With the role of his parents, he was extremely attached to his mother. His mother passed away early on from breast cancer, and that's actually I had a colleague who studied psychoanalysis and said like, oh, that's why you see all the breasts in Dali's work. And like, maybe. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it, but possibly. His father remarried to his aunt, and that sounds very strange to us now, but this is the early 20th century in very rural Spain. Some of these traditions were not actually that strange at that time.
I mean, to me, it sounds sort of like a betrayal.
Yeah,
she's gone. I'm going for her sister.
Right. No, I exactly. But that wouldn't have been such an unusual familial relationship at that time. The same thing is true about the dead brother, because there's a lot of discussion about the fact that his elder brother was also named Salvador, and then his brother died, and so they named him Salvador. And it's like, oh, I can't believe you named him the same thing as the deceased first Salvador. But again, that wasn't actually so unusual, and his father was Salvador. And so, it's there's certain things that have been made a lot of that within context I don't think are so shocking. But certainly, if we want to get Freudian, he talks about his dead brother a lot, and he thinks about himself trying to sort of live up to this brother who never matured. And so you're like, how do I become great, or how do I fulfill all of that he could have been, right? So he's very aware of how these things could have affected him in different ways. And when in 1929, he has an exhibition in Paris that includes a painting called "Sometimes I Spit with Pleasure on the Portrait of My Mother." And it's actually an anti-clerical painting. It's actually a painting of the Virgin Mary.
The mother is the Madonna.
Exactly. But his dad doesn't know that, hears about the title and thinks that he's sitting on the portrait of his deceased wife. He's also very upset, this is Dali's father, that now the young Dali has taken up with a married woman, Gala Elward. And so he ends up throwing him out of the house. And huge rift in the family, but Dali actually frames that as an Oedipal struggle, where he's saying, like, well, look, I'm now battling my father figure. So I mean, he's very cognizantly Freudian about everything that's happening in his life, which is interesting. And if you know that lens, then you can kind of follow along, but also he's sometimes a little bit too knowledgeable about what's going on from sort of a psychoanalytic way. And you just can't trust that what he says is happening is actually what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, the person who is most or autobiographically similar, let's say, to Dali was actually in my brief moment studying Andy Warhol during my master's thesis, because they're very different people, very different dynamics, obviously, but their relationship to the public it doesn't match, but it rhymes, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I have for a very long time loved the connection between Dali and Warhol, because and there's a wonderful book now by I want to say Torsten Otte of Dali and Warhol that really follows along their friendship, if we can call it that. They knew one another. They were always very much in competition, a little bit like Dali and Picasso. And so Warhol thought Dali was old. Dali thought Warhol was just sort of like fad, but yet they were both very famous. They were both very popular to the public. They didn't, they didn't understand the other's fame in a certain way, but they fed off of each other in that way. And certainly when Warhol's writing about Dali, it's like, I love Dali because he's so big. I love Dali because he's so famous. And that really did become a prototype for what Warhol would eventually become in terms of, being at the concerts, taking on all of these publicity things. Before there was Andy Warhol's interview, there was Dali News, and I think that that's a really interesting connection in terms of mass culture.
Yeah, and especially in Dali's later works. And I don't know whether this is Warhol feeding off of Dali or Dali feeding off of Warhol, probably a bit of both. But Dali seems to incorporate towards the end of his life, towards the nuclear mysticism phase, more photographic images in his work that sort of look to me like they were elements of a screen print, but he's actually going in and painting them.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that as happening more, but he does certainly say in The Unspeakable Confessions that his favorite, which is 1973, that the works of art that he's always admired were done from photographs, which actually contrasts a bit with what we were saying about Vermeer and Velasquez and Raphael. But he does copy from photos, maybe more and more. But he was doing a version of that in the 20s and 30s. He was actually cutting out collage pieces and sticking them on his canvases. And so he was integrating it, but maybe in a different sort of way. Before, maybe it's a little bit more to trick the eye, whereas later on, it's really looking at, well, what kind of imagery is floating around in more of a pop sort of style.
And we'd also have to keep in mind that photographs were just so much more available at that point.
Exactly. The quality of the photographs, the availability, absolutely.
So we've gone through quite a bit there. So this is going to be a touchy topic, maybe, for our audience, but I was going to bring up Dali's sexuality. So in his biography, his autobiographies, there's an element of homoeroticism to him. He had relationships with, which Spanish poet was it? His name escapes me.
Federico Garcia Lorca.
Yes, Federico Garcia Lorca. So he was friends with him. He claims Lorca had made advances on him, but that he had respinted him, as it were. So what is to be made of his sexuality? He also had a very interesting relationship with Gala, let's say.
Right. So I think that, unlike Warhol, for whom I think sexuality is really, I think that his sexuality is really important for understanding a lot of his iconography.
Yeah.
With Dali, I'm not sure that his personal sexual proclivities are so necessary for understanding what he's doing. It's interesting to sort of ponder in sort of a, I don't know, lascivious way, but it doesn't necessarily help us always understand the artworks. Yeah. That said, I mean, things that I think we can say conclusively, he did have a relationship with Lorca, when he was in Madrid. That he was a student in Madrid in the 1920s, so we can say, he was at least bisexual at this moment. Later on, after he meets Gala, he stays with Gala his entire life. I mean, they meet in 1929. They're married in a civil ceremony in 34, and they're together until she passes away in 1983. Now, there are, particularly on her side, there are a lot of affairs that she was having, and there are a lot of stories that have come up in books like Carlos Lozano's Sex, Surrealism, Dali and Me. Amanda Lear has different stories, but there's certainly a wild atmosphere going around Dali in like the 1960s and 70s especially. But he's not, as far as I can tell, ever partaking in like an orgy, even though it's happening around him. I think he liked all the atmosphere. He talks a lot about this. I guess I'll call it a paraphilia that he has, called claydalism. He invents this, and he calls it claydalism, is the clay Dali, or the key of Dali, which you mentioned about the sewing machine and umbrella, there being a tension. He really liked the tension. And so he would, and I've heard this from different models and different people who were close to him, he would try to create these sexual encounters where people would get very, very close, but not actually touch. And he really liked that sort of erotic charge of two people, that you have two naked bodies together or something, but not quite actually interacting. And he, not his own, but actually just to watch that.
Yes.
And so in a funny way, that seems to have been the thing that excited him the most, was that, to see the energy, like a sexual energy that didn't actually get consummated. But I don't know how much that actually, I mean, you could apply that in some ways, like, well, maybe that's what's happening in the floating objects or something like that. But it's probably a stretch to say that. I think that this is kind of like,
Yeah.
a personal sort of thing that he liked, that I don't know how much it actually goes into the kind of art, because it's, his models, like for Velasquez and Raphael, he was looking at other places.
Yeah. I have to say though, I did notice that in a great amount of his paintings, there's a lot of almost touching going on. The
Yeah.
objects tend to be isolated, but I had read that in a completely different way before knowing this particular detail about him. So, he could be going post factum, if that's even a Latin term. I don't know. I didn't study Latin. I studied the stupid version of Latin, which is Italian.
How did you read it before?
Before I had just considered it like almost, he's placing these objects in these isolated, hermetic sort of landscapes where they can become these sorts of machines which are cut off from the rest of the world, and you're allowed to contemplate them or see them work actions on each other. They're almost like they're almost pure forms in the sense that they're untouched by anything. They just exist in these desert landscapes. It's a very poetic way of looking at it, I suppose. But
and formally, that's probably much. I mean, frankly, at that time, that could be, coming out of his affinity for Tanguy or
yes.
de Chirico, who have those isolated figures or objects within those sorts of scenes. I mean, the same way when you look at nuclear mysticism and you have everything floating, you have the Virgin Mary floating above the sea or something. Now with the story of Cladism, it's like, oh, well, is that the tension or what is that space? But it adds another angle to looking at it, I guess.
Well, since we were on it, I did want to bring up Yves Tanguy because, especially for Dali's early work, Tanguy seems to be a very big influence. There's a story which I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but Tanguy's daughter claimed that Dali had said to her that he nicked everything from your father. That was the quote she said. Now, that's Tanguy's daughter, so it's again a little bit out there. But what would you have to say about the relationship between Tanguy's work, and Tanguy was a self-taught artist. He saw Giorgio de Chirico's work, apparently got off the bus and just started painting.
Well, that's actually what I was going to say, is that, if anybody's nicking anything, everybody is nicking off of de Chirico. Because de Chirico has these metaphysical paintings that have, rubber gloves and trains going through tunnels and everything else in these empty landscapes. And I mean, Tanguy is one. Magritte is another. Magritte sees a de Chirico painting and the same thing, like, oh, I'm going to start doing that style. And then Dali is looking at these other styles. I think it actually is all coming from a certain shared wellspring of this sort of unusual imagery. I mean, if you're comparing it to automatism, this is a totally different way of thinking about surrealist images, that they're strange, they're solitary, and yet they have a little bit of a mystique about them, right? It feels dreamlike without necessarily being overtly strange. And I think that's kind of, I mean, you mentioned the unheimlich, right? There's something there's something uncanny about those, that it seems familiar, yet it's so strange, and that's something that the surrealists were always latching onto, that sort of that tension.
Well, the Italians will be glad that they have not only invented the bidet, they have not only invented French cuisine, as so many Italians will tell you, but they have also invented surrealism. So congratulations, Italians, you beat the French to it once again. That's a joke for any Italians in the audience. So we've gotten through sex. Let's talk about politics.
Okay.
So we know about Freud and psychoanalysis, but Andre Breton and Dali for a little while. Andre Breton was a Marxist-Leninist. And again, that generated a lot of splits. Antonin Artaud, for example, Artaud rather, not Artaud, was not a Marxist. He actually had a small faction that broke off from the Surrealists, and Dali was in contact with that faction before he got to the mainstream. So I mean, what were Dali's politics when he joined the Surrealist movement? How do you feel like they changed over time? Or how do you feel like maybe we could even talk about how the Surrealists were interested in politics?
Right. So that's a really big topic, but it's a really wonderful and rich one. So I'll start out with the Surrealists because, you know, they're initially a bunch of poets who are writing their manifesto against moral and aesthetic considerations. And it happens to be that manifesto is published in 1924, which is the same year that Lenin dies. Now, there is a growing French Communist Party at that time, and the Surrealist magazine is called the Surrealist Revolution, La Révolution Surréaliste. And they're really kind of presenting it like this is a revolution of thought. And the French Communist Party begins sort of asking around. I mean, like, so when you're using this word, that word revolution has a lot of power behind it. Are you a real revolution or are you a bourgeois revolution? You know, are you actually for the people, or do you just sit in the cafes and write poetry and, you know, and sell artwork? Because Breton and many of his peers were actually art dealers as well. That was kind of their side gig when they were. You know, Paul Eluard was already well off from family money, and so, you know, these were actually pretty materially okay people. You know,
Yeah.
they weren't factory workers. And the PCF, the Parti Communiste Français, was feeling like, okay, well, you're talking about revolution, but you're not really revolutionaries. And this got the Surrealists really sort of worked up. And so in 1927, what you were referring to, Breton aligns with the French Communist Party and says, okay, Surrealism is going to be Marxist now. And that's when Artaud and some of his group, you know, split off and say, you know, that's never what Surrealism was supposed to be about. And we'll find in time that, you know, Artaud was probably right, because this is going to be a really difficult marriage for a while. The Surrealists really try. You know, the Surrealists are, you know, they're anti-nationalist, they're anti-colonialist, so they take a position against the colonialist exhibition in 1931. They're doing some of the same things that the French Communist Party is doing, but they also have this whole push on Freudian automatism. And the PCF doesn't understand how that fits in with the rise of the proletariat. Now, Dali, you know, he had been in his youth more of an anarchist. He was perceived apparently in the 1920s as being sort of Bolshevist in Catalonia, but he was very, you know, he was very left wing going in. And I think that when he joins the Surrealists, he's kind of okay with the rhetoric that's surrounding it. I don't think he probably really cares so much, but he's like, okay, well, let's, you know, sure, if this is what the group is doing, you know, we want a revolution, yes, absolutely, let's do it. The thing that really breaks things apart actually around Dali is that in 1931, and there's already a lot of sort of splintering in the Surrealist group of Louis Aragon going out to the USSR and having to say that surrealism, like having to renounce surrealism and things like that. But Dali publishes a poem called Daydream, Reverie, in the Surrealist New Journal, which is called Surrealism in the Service of the Revolution. So you see they've changed their name in order to show that it's not just a surrealist revolution, it's surrealism in the service of the revolution. So the revolution is this Marxist revolution. But he publishes Daydream, and Daydream is a wild poem that is about, like, it launches off about him looking at a Vermeer painting that sends him into an ecstasy that he starts masturbating, and then it just becomes this whole sexual storyline. And the French Communist Party gets a hold of this, and they're like, okay, how is this awful, awful text in any way advancing the proletariat. And Breton is basically put in this weird position where he has to either go with the PCF or censor Dali, despite the whole notion of freedom of expression. And so he ends up having to sort of side with Dali, and he hates that. That it's like surrealism is supposed to be about freedom, and this is a free poem, so we're going to go with that. But then Dali kind of goes off the rails a little bit, because now this is actually, I think, where he starts falling out with the French Communist Party, because now they have censored his writing. And, he's kind of fine with everything until you start telling him what to do. And then he gets prickly. And so at that point, you start getting paintings like, the six heads of Lenin materializing on a grand piano. So you have like the glowing heads of Lenin on the piano, or most famously, the Enigma of William Tell,
yes,
which is a huge painting that's in Stockholm now, that was shown at the Salon des Indépendants, of Vladimir Lenin without pants. And the surrealists had actually voted that they weren't going to take part in this, and Dali displays this enormous, unflattering Lenin. And everybody freaks out, as you would expect. And so, Dali's just like pushing it all the time. So I think that if we think about his politics, I think that he's sort of ambivalent. And I think this actually goes all the way through. He's fine with being with the group until it doesn't really suit his agenda. And then he's just a little bit too, he likes to make trouble, right? He likes to bother the group, and this is what gets his trial. He's tried by the Surrealist group in 1934 for what they call anti-revolutionary acts towards the glorification of Hitlerian fascism. And they're saying like, oh, you're too interested in Hitler. You're painting Lenin without pants. You're just going completely right wing. He's like, no, I'm just doing these paintings, and he gets kind of floppy, rather, right? He's cavalier. He's cavalier with subjects that are really important at that time, and I think that that's probably what puts him starts to put him on the outs with the Surrealist group. Now, going forward, that self-interest, I'll say, basically is what drives him politically. So, in my view, and so when we have the Spanish Civil War. It's not a simple thing to look back on. I think that now we can look back and say like, oh, Dali started supporting Franco, but within his family, the nationalists had all killed. They had killed Lorca, first of all, but then on the left, the communists in Cadiquez had captured his sister Anna Maria and tortured her. And so a lot of Dali's family had become nationalists because of the treatment of Anna Maria. And it's interesting that Dali himself, he doesn't actually take any sides, right? That's what the Surrealists are really upset at. They're like, you're from Spain, you should be supporting the Republicans. But he has, he almost sees it like Goya, where there are awful things happening on both sides. So he doesn't want to kind of put his support on one side or the other. He kind of stands back and is like, it's awful, and that's just what you get in a painting like Soft Construction with Boiled Beans. It's ugly no matter any way you look at it. But then after the war, after it's all over, then he begins trying to get back to Spain, and the only way to really do that is to express support for Franco, and that's what he does. And that's where it gets really problematic for those who look at the later part of his life and consider him, at best a sellout, at worst a fascist, right? And those are conversations that are still very prominent in discussions and in conversations around Dali's work. What were his political proclivities, and how much should we criticize him, today for positions that he took through 50s, 60s, 70s, etc.
Yeah, and again, that happens with several other artists. Picasso famously was a very abusive person towards women, but in this case, at the very least, Dali seems to be acting to at least try and remain with his family, which is, I feel like a sympathetic position to take.
I know I'm sympathetic to Dali, but I've been to this part of Spain, and I know he was so attached to getting back to Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like that was the thing that mattered to him. it was you kind of say anything to get back to Spain. And we look at that now and be like, that probably wasn't the most savory thing to do. But I just don't see him as really ever caring all that much. As long as he could still paint and do the things that he wanted to do, I think that he was just sort of ambivalent. And then we can look back and say, like, well, ambivalence is its own political position, but at least it's not really like falling in and saying like, oh, he really believed in this sort of thing. I think he just didn't care. I mean, he had privilege. I mean, he was very famous, very wealthy, and he had privilege, and I think that's just the truth of it.
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of protected by his father's wealth, and to a certain extent by Gala, who managed a lot of his business affairs too.
Sure. I mean, much less so by his father's wealth. I mean, his father was a notary, which I mean was pretty good business in Figueres, but he didn't have a ton of family money. But they were middle class kinds of people. They were all right, but he wasn't like swimming in it or anything. His real money comes after he moves to the United States in the 40s, because that's where he becomes very successful commercially. And then, in the 60s and 70s, I heard a really fascinating thing that I'll just share with you since we're here, which was that in the 1960s, he had a sort of a business advisor named Peter Moore. And I knew about Peter Moore. He's passed away now, but he had been he was in the military in England. And he actually used to serve under Winston Churchill. But Dali took him up as a military, what he called a military advisor. And but when he flew Peter Moore to New York to discuss the arrangement of the contract, he said, okay, so here it is. I'm not going to pay you, but you can have a percentage of any sort of contracts that you negotiate, except for paintings. You can have like 30%. I don't remember what the percentage was, but you can have a percent of any of the commercial contracts that you negotiate.
Oh, I'm seeing where this is going.
Yeah. And so Peter Moore is like, okay, so he begins negotiating all of these commercial projects, and he makes like $30,000 in the first weekend. It's like, hey, this is a gig. And suddenly he realizes, like, I can basically market Dali, make a ton of money doing this, and that's where I'm getting financed. And so Dali's real commercialism explodes in the 60s. And so, a lot of that's actually one of the reasons, just to bring it back to the Songs of Maldoror, which we should, is that, Dali does a lot of graphic suites. He does a lot of illustrations. He illustrates Alice in Wonderland. At that point, he'll illustrate almost anything. He illustrates the poems of Chairman Mao. He illustrates the craziest stuff that you would never expect him to illustrate. So in the 60s and 70s, you have tons of illustrations, tons of graphic projects that he does. And that's largely money making, I'll be honest. He is paid to illustrate books, and so he does. And those vary wildly in quality. Sometimes he really tries hard, sometimes he doesn't really care, he kind of phones it in. But what's great about the Songs of Maldoror is that it's so early, he really cared. Like this is his first big illustration commission. And it's to illustrate a book that was so central to the Surrealists. And it's kind of his first, I mean, he's not big in America yet. He's not going to be on the cover of Time for another 2 years. So this is really Dali when he's just emerging, and he is being really genuine in wanting to do a good job. And these are genuinely the ideas and the thoughts and a real reflection of his paranoiac ideas at that time. So this isn't just illustrations. This is when like it really counts, when he's really working, and he's working with an amazing Roger Le Courrier, an amazing printmaker. These are they're very rare. They have the drawings along the outside, or the not drawings. They have
marginalia.
They have the marginalia. I'm trying to remember the word for that. They have the marginalia etchings that are along the outside. This is a really special suite, and I think that perhaps that can get lost to people who don't know that much about printmaking, or don't care all that, who don't know that much, because it's like, oh, they're first of all, people will often come in and say, oh, they're drawings. Well, they're not drawings. They're prints, but they're really special prints. So Dali had initially drawn these out and engraved them in celluloid, and then he passed them along to Roger Le Courrier, who made these copper plates out of etchings, which means you drop these drawings into acid, and the acid eats away the drawing so that you can make the plates, and then you can start making them. Now, I told you that Skira was planning on making 200 of these, but they got to 40, and they realized this is really too labor intensive. And so then they started another way of doing things, which is called photogravure, which is a way of almost, it's a mechanical reproduction process. And those are fine. Those are great. Those are museum pieces. That's what you would find at MoMA, actually.
Yeah,
are the photogravures. But these are the original etchings. These are from one of those original etchings. And they're actually the set that used to belong to Le Courrier, the etcher.
So these are like artist proofs, basically.
These are the set that were so good. Dali had one, Le Courrier had one. Like, these are like the best of the best for this set. So if you had one of the first 40 sets on view, it'd be extraordinary. To actually have Le Courrier's set on view, that's amazing. And to have, like I said, the etchings, not the photogravures. In the 1960s, another 60 or so copies were made by Pierre Argelais. So those are another set. So now we have about 200 copies of this thing sort of floating around. But this is one of the very first versions of it done by the original hands. And I think it's so, once you really realize what it is, it's like, wow, this is really, really special.
Yeah, because I've had to explain that to so many people who I'm telling about the show in advance. There's two different versions. We have the real ones,
yes.
Which people know Dali's name, they get excited for Dali's name, but knowing that these are like genuine things that his hand was at least only twice removed from instead of thrice.
Yeah, and really working with the printmaker. It wasn't just sort of like
Yes.
sending it in and like, do your best and I'll find them later or whatever. It was, yeah, he was really directly involved because, again, this was a really important commission for it. So this wasn't something he was just doing with Peter Moore to make money. This was really special.
Yeah. Now we've mentioned that Dali went to America, and one story that a connection, let's say, I found absolutely fascinating was Dali's brief connection with Joseph Cornell, who is a famous American artist who did a film called, I don't know whether you know this, probably, Rose Hobart, which was sort of like this collage style dreamlike film. And Dali seemed to have been sort of outraged at the first screening. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but he apparently claimed that Joseph Cornell must have managed to somehow steal psychically the idea for this film from his mind.
Yes, that's exactly the story. I think that story comes from the gallerist Julian Levy, so it's less likely that it was made up by Dali. But apparently Cornell was quite a kind of a timid and shy person, and so he was really paralyzed that Dali stood up and yelled this and marched out that this whole idea was out of his head. Dali had done a lot of different types of film, but Rose Hobart's a really fascinating experimental film. It feels very, very avant-garde today. He took a film called East of Borneo, and he cut out all of the different scenes with Rose Hobart and pieced them together and put sort of a Brazilian soundtrack to it. I really enjoy watching it. It's a strange film. Like it feels like a little bit of like trance music or something, I think, because you watch watching it, you're a little bit kind of like, what's going on? Because there isn't a story anymore. It's just kind of like zooming in. But it actually feels in a way like something Warhol would do later on, of like taking different types of things, stills, piecing them together in a different way. As I say, it really feels like much more like avant-garde cinema, building on collage, but doing something really different.
Or even like a proto-Rauschenberg.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I just have to point out for those listening, Joseph Cornell was not a surrealist, or at least not to my knowledge. I don't know how much knowledge he had of the surrealist movement.
No, he kind of discovered surrealism through the Julian Levy Gallery.
Okay.
So he was so the Julian Levy Gallery was having shows on surrealism starting in 1932,
Mm.
and he he was making these wonderful boxes. That was really what his real talent was making these game boxes. But they're certainly collage like. I mean, he didn't speak in the same way as a lot of the surrealists about his work in terms of the unconscious or revolution or something like that. But again, surrealism isn't just a very one way direction,
Yes.
right?
If we're to consider it a process, he was working in a process that's at least suspiciously similar
Yes.
to surrealism.
And he certainly exhibited with surrealists.
Yes.
He exhibited in surrealism shows. I don't honestly know which major shows he was involved in going through the 1930s, but I wouldn't hesitate to. I teach Joseph Cornell in my surrealism class. I wouldn't hesitate to identify him as surrealist or surrealist adjacent in
Right.
any way.
Now, a bit more relevant to Dali is Jacques Lacan,
Hmm.
who people who know theory might know about, but for people who are less familiar, he came up with the concept of the mirror stage, in which the child is shown or it sees itself in the mirror and realizes it's a displaced subject to a certain extent. I can't explain it. I'm not a Lacanian, thank God. But the two had made contact. Lacan had published his dissertation, I believe, and Dali had managed to get his hands on it, and wrote letters to Lacan, and they had a brief correspondence. And Lacan even published a paper about artistic works and paranoia and the work of the artist. What could we say about how Lacan influenced Dali's practice, or maybe how Dali influenced Lacan's writing?
So yeah, it was an amazing uh I'd say cross pollination, honestly, in the early 30s. Uh Lacan was actually writing his doctoral dissertation on paranoia.
Yes.
And he was using that term paranoia in the same, as a way of kind of the looking at the world askew, as I said. And what really fascinated him was the systemization of paranoia. That when somebody is in a delusion, everything kind of fits within that delusion. Um, and that's what really struck him when he was writing about it, was how everything kind of fit within that whole systemization. And Dali writes about a systemization of confusion.
Yes.
And so Dali really kind of took that from Lacan, that this delirium that he was having, it wasn't random. It actually fit within a whole system of observations, of associations, that everything was related, or at least could be explained by everything else. And so
Yes.
the paranoiac's view of the world was actually quite organized, even if it looked different from everybody else.
I think Lacan described it as a hypertrophy of the reasoning function,
Oh, nice. Okay.
where you're reasoning. I'm sorry, but you're
No, please.
reasoning far too much, and coming up with all of these different motives or ideas to represent the end that you want to achieve. It's like almost like artificial intelligence, large language models hallucinating until they come to the resolution that you ask them to.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I have to confess, I know obviously much more about Dali than Lacan, but
Yes.
I know that that's really interesting to think about how he's thinking about as overthinking and overanalyzing, because that's, if Dali was anything, he was overanalyzing everything that he was doing. So as I understand, and I think this story, I believe, is from The Secret Life, but I think it's probably true, because Dali was working on his paranoiac critical method. Lacan was working on his dissertation on paranoia. And Lacan ends up writing some articles that get published in Minotaur. And so he's sort of in the fringes of surrealism. He knew things were going on. And how exactly, like what spurred them to meet, I don't really know. But Dali does tell a story that it's just kind of a funny anecdote, but it's probably true. That at the time he was working on a portrait, which ends up being the portrait of Marie-Laure de Noailles. And it was on copper. And the gleam on his nose was making it hard for him to see what was going on. And so he put a piece of paper, like a kind of a paper cone, over his nose. And then Jacques Lacan comes in, and they have this whole conversation about paranoia. And it's not until after Lacan leaves that he happens to glance over and realize he's done the entire thing with this piece of paper on it. How like strange this must have looked, because Lacan never said anything about it.
I could imagine that actually being true.
It feels very true, actually, that they had this long
Yes.
conversation and he just acted like everything was totally normal without this with this piece of paper. But they didn't stay in touch. I think they reconnected once, I want to say in the 60s or 70s. I think there's a photograph of the two of them together when they're quite, advanced in age. But they didn't stay in touch throughout after the 1930s. Lacan becomes this, kind of superstar of psychoanalysis, and Dali goes into art, but they don't. Their connections don't really intersect. But there have been readings of paintings like the Metamorphosis of Narcissus, where Narcissus is looking down into the lake and saying, like, is this sort of could we interpret this through Lacan's mirror stage, right? Or how could we apply Lacanian ideas to Dali's work? And I think that that's a really rich way of thinking about him in terms of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I think it really helps the paintings to become more expansive. Freud's theories tend to limit you because you're going to end up at the Oedipal complex a lot of the time.
Yes, my students are, sometimes I'll get the evaluations like, why is it always about sex? It's like, no, because Freud was always about sex. That's kind of where it all comes back to at the end. So yes, it is kind of nice if you can find other avenues to build it out.
So you talk about cross-pollination. Now, there were a lot of people writing in Minotaur and the revolution and the surrealism and the revolution of service of revolution, excuse me. So are there any other like theorists or writers that you think he was paying particular attention to?
Well, let's see here. So other people who were writing at that time, certain people who just come to mind. Maurice N. was one of the first biographer of the Marquis de Sade. And so Sade had just been rediscovered, and sort of like Lautréamont, the surrealists kind of tacked onto Sade.
Yes.
And they were doing their version of, Sade, the namesake of sadism, of course. And so they were writing about, Maurice N. was writing about Sade in his journal, and that was getting published in Minotaur. The other theorists who were writing about things, I think that Dali was also really influenced by Bataille's writing. Now, Bataille wasn't writing in the surrealist journals, but he had his own journal, Document, that was actually trying to get Dali over, at the very beginning. And a lot of artists and writers who would get kind of fed up with Breton and that group would kind of go over to Bataille. Bataille's view of everything that the surrealists were doing was quite different, but there was something much darker, more gritty, more material about Bataille's work, and he actually does a handwriting analysis of the Marquis de Sade in his work. But I think that there's something really, there's no doubt that Bataille was influencing a lot of what Dali was doing, probably more so than Breton in certain cases, because of the way that Bataille was writing about the base materialism and what really unites us is not grand love and poetics, but actually the earthy disgust that would have intrigued Dali a lot.
Yeah, there's a 1977 interview in Spanish that I watched where Dali refers to himself as a pig. He says, because I go beyond, voy oltre, I think he says. And he says, I just keep going despite all of the terrible things. I just keep going. So that sort of sounds a bit like Bataille in a sense.
Yeah, and nothing is ever beyond the pale, even perhaps when it, later on we might hope that he would just stop, but he doesn't.
So there was a quote, and we can do something with this or not. I'm not certain how well we would be able to come at a resolution, but the conquest of the irrational was like the text I ended up referring to most during my research for Dali's opinion. but he's talking about his and Picasso's work in the same vein at this time, and he says that their work proves this need of concrete materialization in current reality, of giving objective value on the real plane to the delirious unknown world of our irrational experiences, against the remembrance of dreams and the virtual and impossible images of purely receptive states, quote, that can only be recounted. There are the physical facts of objective irrationality with which one can already actually wound oneself. So when I looked at it, it's like he's trying to connect form to language and saying, you know, abstraction is a system that you always have to recount to the viewer, right? It has to be explained. But, you know, by using the physical world, the viewer, and again, where I'm jumping back to Lacan, where it's like the viewer has the opportunity to find that whole be real, right? That they can start injecting holes into. I don't know where I was going with that question, but.
Well, I think it really, I mean, the conquest of the irrational is really cutting to the heart of the paranoiac critical method.
Yes.
And, you know, it might even be worth noting that when that was actually published, first in French, it came with a red band around it that said it was against socialist realism. Now,
oh boy, I see here. I was reading it as he was against abstraction.
Well, he's against abstraction
like
as
pure
well.
abstraction.
Pure abstraction as well, right? Because pure abstraction is just sort of meaningless blotches, as he would describe them. He's also, you know, this is right after the French Communist Party had censured reverie, you know, within a couple of years, and so, you know, Stalin had just implemented the policies of socialist realism, saying that art needed to be proletariat, it needed to be understandable to the masses, it had to be partisan. Basically, it had to be, you know, a certain recipe, right? Propagandistic.
Yes.
And Dali is like, no, I'm not going to buy that. So he's against both sides, actually. He's against the high figuration that is very specific and saying, like, this is, I'm going to teach you something
yes.
through naturalism. And then he's also against something like, you know, Kandinsky, or, you know, at that time, well, he's always against Piet Mondrian. He hates Piet Mondrian.
I'm not surprised.
So he hates Piet Mondrian because he's like, okay, so what's the point of a Piet Mondrian? He writes later that, you know, Piet niet, like there's nothing to Piet Mondrian. So both those ideas are sort of the two polars, right? Now, when he says that he wants to have in current reality these, well, you said the objective irrationality, this is again kind of looking at those clouds or those things and saying, like, okay, we can say objectively that there is something out there, but nobody's reading it in such a way that's entirely rationalist. Like, nobody's just saying, like, okay, well, those are the clouds and that is the truth. Like, everybody has their own version of the truth, right? Everybody has their own way of seeing it. Everybody has their own subjective experiences. Everybody has this irrational thing about them that colors the way that they receive the world. And that's kind of the crux of the paranoid critical method. And it's also the, you know, how do we conquest of the irrational? How do we, you know, embrace the irrational, right? How do we see the irrational out there and say, like, okay, yes, the irrational is there, but actually that's not something to shun, that's something to celebrate, because that's what we all have and it's how we're all viewing the world. And in fact, my irrationality, this is Dali speaking, I can show you how I'm reading the world, right? I can show you that these images are double images or triple images. I can show you that there isn't just one way of looking at this. And if there's more than one way of looking at anything, how can you say that's rational? So I think there is something, but I'm going to materialize that for you. I'm not just going to talk about it abstractly. I'm not going to, you know, write scores about this. I'm going to give you a painting that really kind of makes your, you know, eyebrow raise here and say, like, look, here is a face, but at the same time it's a fruit dish, which at the same time is a dog, which is at the same time a philosopher in the landscape. And all these things are actually true at the same time, right? Like, it's not that it's one thing and then the other things go away. Like, they're all true. So you want to just pick one? You can. And that's a really, I mean, that's actually a very philosophical way about thinking about the world, right? I mean, that's you know, to go away from rationalism. The surrealists were always going away from just saying, oh, we're not going to be rationalist, but this is a real step towards, well, let's be relativist. You know, let's really think about the subjective experience, you know, more so than the personal experience. Let's just think, okay, well, how are we all viewing this differently?
Well, and he even brings Heraclitus into play, and I think he brings it into into the text of Conquest of the Irrational.
Heraclitus the Obscure, because
Heraclitus the Obscure, because nobody could understand what he was saying.
exactly.
Not even the Greeks.
So yeah, he embraces that because, you know, he doesn't want to say anything plainly, that's for sure.
No, absolutely not. So just a couple more questions. I was kind of wondering to myself, so when I think of modernism, I think actually of people like Piet Mondrian, of Le Corbusier, you know, especially Le Corbusier, the idea of a machine for living, right? Mm-hmm. So when I think of modernism, I think of this idea of we can rationally, right, come to this conclusion. We can bring progress towards maybe not just a technological or a material world that's better, but also a spiritual one. You know, Kandinsky was very connected to the spiritualist movement. Mm-hmm. So even though surrealism is sort of lumped in as a modernism, how modernist do you think we might be able to consider Dali or the surrealist in general? Because, you know, they don't propose any sort of grand schema, or at least not Dali especially.
So surrealism's often spoken of, particularly lately, I find, in terms of romanticism, which is interesting to think about.
I mean, it makes sense because even, you know, Lautréamont or Isidore Ducasse, he was obsessed with the romantic authors.
Exactly, and it's those romantic ideas of, rather than rationalism, you know, what you're really, the real meat is the irrational that is under the surface of that. And that was more of a 19th century concept, probably. You know, I think as you start going into modernism, the thing is, modernism becomes increasingly formalist. And when I say formalist, you know, really more about, you know, or at least it's framed as more and more formalist, about the line, the color, the shape, the texture. You know, the art historians who are waving the flag for Cézanne are saying, you know, like, what's the form that really is the difference? And the surrealists aren't about form. Like, the surrealists are about the process. They're about the idea. And in that way, they're really unusual in the walk of modernism. I mean, if I lay out the you know, famous works of art from these time frames, you know, surrealism looks very different. You know, I mean, it looks like a throwback. And that's somebody like an art critic like Clement Greenberg. That's one of the reasons he hated surrealism, because he said, like, this is it's atavistic, right? I think that's the word you used before. Like, it's like, why would you go back and paint a melting clock, but you're not doing anything with the form? You're just painting it in the same style as Vermeer, but but of course he's saying, like, you know, if it has nothing to do with Vermeer, you're just painting it old-fashioned. You know, you're painting it in old style. It's a new subject, but it's old. It's already old the moment it's painted. And so, in a large way, I think that a lot of, I mean, the automatists, I think, can be sort of fit in with this modernist storyline, your Massons, your Mirots, but surrealism overall is a little bit of a strange idea within the wider ideas of modernism. And it's one of the reasons, I think, that surrealism gets sort of shoved aside in 1940 when abstract expressionism kicks in, because in reality, many of your abstract expressionists were highly influenced by surrealism. You know, Mark Rothko loved surrealism. Pollock, highly influenced by surrealism.
Well, both of their work, they practically started out doing surrealist or set or expressionist works.
Yeah, they're looking at Jung, they're looking at psychoanalysis, they're looking at the idea of automatic thought. All of these artists, but they don't get talked about by the museums and the critics. They don't get framed as surrealism because surrealism is sort of an old European term that is kind of the old school, and now this is supposed to be the new American movement. So yeah, in the grand march of modernism, there's a big effort to push surrealism aside, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that a lot of people don't even know the surrealism continues. A lot of books like end in 1940 if you're looking at surrealism. But surrealism comes over. I mean, there's international surrealism exhibitions, 40s, 50s, 60s. There's 1970s. There was actually an international surrealism show not too long ago in Cairo. When I say not too long ago, in the last couple of years in Cairo. There are still surrealists out there, artists, writers, poets, who are currently surrealists. And one wouldn't think like that you would have impressionists working today, but it shows that there is a longevity, that it's more of an idea, that it's more of a process to things. But I think that this modernist notion has sort of pushed those ideas out and said like, okay, well, no, surrealism died. In a way, it's maybe anticipating more post-modern concerns. It's more about multiplicity. It's more about internationalization. It's more about subjectivity. It's more about embracing popular culture. It's there are a lot of things that make surrealism more relevant later, whereas in maybe the 40s and even the 50s, it seemed very strange. Now, Dali is even a stranger case in some of those cases because not only was he associated with surrealism, but then he turns his work in the 40s and 50s to Catholic iconography. And like, what could be less modernist than that? At that particular moment, that's the strangest thing he could have possibly done. But now we can look back at that and it's like, well, maybe that was actually sort of, I find that very interesting. Like, those are actually some of my favorite pieces personally, because I think like, no, who else would be a major international artist in 1945 and do a painting of the Madonna and Child?
Well, who would see
isn't ironic.
Who would see the nuclear bomb and say Jesus is real?
Right? Yeah. That DNA proves the existence of God. Like all of these things he's throwing out there that sound so crazy, but then when you start really listening to them, like, well, he's backing it up, and it's systematic. Maybe this is paranoia being systematic, but there's a system there. Everything sort of makes sense within Dali's way of thinking about things.
Well, I think there's something particularly relevant to point out there, or rather to justify that, not justify, to point out with surrealism's continuation. Because I think, and this is my perception, but I think you can say today, I'm a surrealist, I'm a surrealist artist, and people will accept that. But, for example, years back, there was a return of abstract expressionism, and it was labeled zombie formalism. Because, all the other artworks, Cubism, Impressionism to a certain extent, abstract expressionism, they because they act almost as technologies, right, that have to be improved and reach a certain point, they have a diminishing return. You end up in a cul-de-sac. Whereas with surrealism, because it's such a loose concept, you're allowed to go in more directions.
And it seems to only develop more relevance, which is also kind of amazing. I mean, the surrealists even in their somewhat, ham-fisted Marxism of the late 1920s and 30s, now we can look back at this and, some scholars are looking back at it and saying, well, look how surrealism would connect with the Great Resignation, right? I mean, like they're Abigail Sussex has a book on like surrealism's war on work and then sort of anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism. All of these ideas actually seem to have a resonance maybe today that hits a lot differently. But all of a sudden, it's like actually there's something really. I mean, the surrealists later on really do some fascinating things, and I wish that got more airtime, because there's in the I think it's 1968, there's a surrealist journal in Paris called Archibras, and they have a Black Power issue. Like
I was gonna say Frantz Fanon, Wilfredo Lam.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Wilfredo Lam, especially
Yeah.
as an actual surrealist artist.
Yeah. Aimé Césaire for Tropique
Mm-hmm.
is really connected. So there's a lot of like, I mean, they become, indigenous rights, environmentalists. You know, Leonora Carrington writes a manifesto against zoos, for animal cruelty. I mean, all of these it becomes really interestingly relevant later on, and it's just not something that people necessarily think about. But there is a surrealist spirit, I think, that is really does transcend that. So, I mean, to say like you're a surrealist, I think surrealism ends up being like so many things. And some people will say like, oh, well, you can't be a surrealist because Breton didn't tap you to be a surrealist or that.
Yeah.
But then I hate to limit it that way, to be honest. I mean, I feel like, there is a surrealist spirit that if you really embrace that ideology, then, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, Breton wanted surrealism to live on. He said, surrealism existed before me and it will live on after me. So I think that that's really what he would have liked to have seen is, maybe not in the direction that it went in so many ways, because now it's everywhere and it's become very commercialized and everybody thinks about soft clocks and all of the things that Breton didn't necessarily want. But you can't say that surrealism has become irrelevant. I mean, it's out there. It's not necessarily zombie surrealism. It is everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a pretty good place to end it, don't you?
Sounds great. Yeah, this has been a great
So
conversation. Thank you.
I loved it. So just for people who might want to learn more about Dali or about surrealism, do you have any recommendations for books? And do you have any forthcoming publications that you're at work on?
Um, so the the book that I started out with, I have to say, is Dali's Secret Life: The Secret Life of Salvador Dali. It's entertaining. It's a great read. It's wild, but it's a great one. Dali's own writings are just very fun to get into. Those autobiographical writings, I think, are a great place to start and kind of get a sense of what he's like. The most thorough biography of Dali is by Ian Gibson.
Oh, The Shameful
The
Life of
Shameful Life.
Salvador Dali.
Yeah, it's
Very unfortunate title because I've read a little bit of it and he's very reasonable actually.
Yeah, the Shameful Life of Salvador Dali is a disappointing title because it gets to the point because Gibson over the course of the book ends up, I think, by his own admission, not really liking Dali all that much.
Yeah.
And so he really starts hitting on a lot of the sour notes of Dali's work. But it's very well researched. I mean, there's almost anything you want to find out about Dali is in that book somewhere. So, I mean, he really takes apart The Secret Life. And it's like, okay, so this is where Dali was exaggerating. This is true. I mean, he does a really good researched thing. In terms of other popular books, Don Addis's book on Dali has been reissued recently, and it's a great approachable introduction to Dali as well. My own scholarship, last book I put out there was a co-edited volume called Radical Dreams, Surrealism and Counterculture. And that's really about surrealism's afterlife that we've been talking about in the 1960s and 70s in protest cultures. But I did write a book in 2007 called Dali's Surrealism in Cinema, which is specifically about his films. And that's still the most thorough book of Dali's films certainly in English. And it translated a number of different scripts for the first time. So yeah, I'm always working on a lot of things with Dali. Right now, I'm working on different interpretations of the persistence of memory. I'm presenting that at a conference actually in about a month in Reykjavik. So yeah, there's always a lot of different avenues for Dali to take me.
Oh, that's great. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope
It's been a
everybody
pleasure.
out there had just as much fun as I did. And I hope you will all come and see the show in September. Salvador Dali, Les Chants de Maldoror.